The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving only the hum of crickets and the weight of silence. Elliot Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, his knuckles pale in the faint glow of the dashboard. Midnight on a deserted Oregon highway, and he was stranded, miles from anywhere, with a gas gauge mocking him at 0. He cursed under his breath, the kind of sharp, desperate curse that comes when you realize you've ignored one too many warning signs. Elliot had been driving for hours, chasing a half-formed dream of starting over in Portland, away from the suffocating small town of Redding, California, where whispers about his sexuality had turned into shouts. His phone was dead, the charger useless without a signal, and the nearest gas station was a memory from 30 miles back. He stepped out into the chilly September air, the pine-scented darkness pressing against him, and popped the hood, more out of habit than hope. The engine stared back, indifferent. Headlights pierced the night, slow and deliberate, pulling Elliot's gaze to the road. A police cruiser rolled to a stop behind his truck, its red and blue lights flickering briefly before going dark. Elliot's stomach twisted. He'd grown up wary of cops. Too many stories of kids like him, queer and alone, getting more trouble than help. He straightened, shoving his hands into his leather jacket, and watched as the officer stepped out. Evening, the officer called, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of warmth. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders filling out his navy uniform. His dark hair was neatly cropped, and his eyes deep brown, catching the moonlight, held a kindness that disarmed Elliot's defenses. Car trouble. Elliot nodded, throat tight. Ran out of gas. Didn't realize how far I was from anything. The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He glanced at the truck, then back at Elliot, his gaze steady but not probing. Name's Caleb. Caleb Monroe. You're safe with me. All right. Let's figure this out. Those words, series safe with me, hit Elliot like a lifeline tossed into choppy waters. He didn't know why, but something in Caleb's voice, in the way his smile softened the edges of the night, made Elliot want to believe him. He nodded again, managing a faint, "Thanks. I'm Elliot." Caleb's smile widened, just enough to show a dimple on his left cheek. "Elliot. Huh. All right. Elliot, you got a spare can in there? Or are we working from scratch?" "No can," Elliot admitted, kicking at the dirt. Didn't plan on breaking down in the middle of nowhere. "Fair enough." Caleb chuckled, low and easy, like they were old friends. "Lucky for you, I've got a spare in the cruiser. Sit tight." As Caleb walked back to his car, Elliot leaned against the truck, his breath visible in the cold. He watched the officer move with a quiet confidence, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark as he rummaged in the trunk. Elliot's mind raced. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not cops. Back in Redding, he'd learned to keep his head down, to hide the part of himself that loved men, because small towns didn't take kindly to people like him. But Caleb's presence felt different, like a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Caleb returned with a red gas can, setting it down near the truck's fuel cap. "This should get you to the next station. About 10 miles up. You headed somewhere specific?" "Portland," Elliot said, hesitating. "Trying to start over, I guess." Caleb's eyes flicked to him, curious but gentle. "Big move. What's in Portland?" "Hopefully a life where I don't have to look over my shoulder every day." The words slipped out before Elliot could stop them, raw and unguarded. He froze, expecting judgment. But Caleb just nodded, like he understood more than Elliot had said. "Portland's good for that," Caleb said, unscrewing the gas can. "Got a cousin there. She's queer, lives with her girlfriend. They're happy. You'll find your people." Elliot's heart stuttered. Queer. The word sounded different coming from Caleb, not like an accusation but a fact, spoken with quiet respect. He wanted to ask how Caleb knew, why he cared, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he watched as Caleb poured the gas, the faint glug of liquid filling the silence. "There we go," Caleb said, stepping back. Try starting her up. Elliot slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over him, but it was laced with something else. A pull toward Caleb, toward the safety he'd promised. You didn't have to do this, Elliot said, stepping out. I mean, you could have just driven by. Caleb shrugged, but his eyes held Elliot's, steady and warm. Not my style. Besides, you look like you could use a break. For a moment, they stood there, the highway stretching endlessly around them, the night alive with possibility. Elliot felt a spark, fragile but undeniable, like the first note of a song he hadn't heard in years. He didn't know Caleb, didn't know if this moment would mean anything beyond tonight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. You good to drive? Caleb asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, Elliot said, though he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. Thanks, Caleb. Really? Caleb tipped his head, that dimple flashing again. Get to that gas station. And, maybe don't run out again. Yeah. Elliot laughed. A small, shaky sound. No promises. As Caleb walked back to his cruiser, Elliot climbed into the truck, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Caleb's taillights fade into the night. Something told him this wasn't the last he'd see of Officer Caleb Monroe. Elliot's truck rumbled along the highway, the fresh gas giving it just enough life to reach the neon-lit gas station 10 miles up. The station was a lonely outpost, its flickering sign reading Pineview Fuel in faded red letters. He pulled up to a pump, the clock on the dashboard reading 12:47 a.m. The night felt heavier now, the adrenaline from his encounter with Caleb fading into a quiet ache. He filled the tank, the cold metal of the pump biting his fingers, and replayed Caleb's words in his head, "You're safe with me." It wasn't just the word "sit," was the way Caleb had looked at him, like he saw past the guarded exterior Elliot had spent years perfecting. Back in Redding, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His family hadn't disowned him. Not exactly. But their silence when he came out at 19 had been loud enough. Friends drifted away, and the town's whispers grew into a chorus of judgment. Portland was supposed to be his escape. But now, with Caleb's smile lingering in his mind, he wondered if escape could mean something more. Inside the station, a tired cashier barely looked up from her phone as Elliot paid for the gas and a coffee that tasted more like regret than caffeine. He stepped back outside, the night air sharp against his skin, and noticed a familiar shape across the Loda police cruiser, parked near the edge of the pavement. His pulse quickened. Caleb. The officer was leaning against the cruiser, arms crossed, his silhouette backlit by the station's harsh fluorescent lights. He spotted Elliot and raised a hand, that same easy smile breaking across his face. Elliot hesitated, then walked over, the coffee warming his hands but doing little for the nervous flutter in his chest. Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Elliot said, stopping a few feet away. Caleb's smile turned playful. Figured I'd make sure you didn't run out of gas again before you hit Portland. Call it professional courtesy. Elliot raised an eyebrow, a spark of boldness surprising him. You check on every stranded driver like this. Only the ones who look like they've got a story. Caleb's voice was light, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, like he was searching for something in Elliot's expression. Elliot shifted, unsure how to navigate this. Flirting wasn't his forte when he'd spent so long hiding who he was. But Caleb's presence, warm and steady, made him want to try. Guess I owe you a story then, he said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. Caleb chuckled, pushing off the cruiser. I've got time. Shift's quiet tonight. You want company to the next town. The offer hung in the air, simple but loaded. Elliot's instinct was to say no, to keep moving, to stick to the plan of disappearing into Portland's anonymity. But something about Caleb, the way he stood close, but not too close, the way his voice carried a promise of safety made Elliot nod. Yeah, company sounds good. They drove separately, Caleb's cruiser trailing Elliot's truck along the winding highway. The road was flanked by towering pines, their shadows dancing in the headlights. Every few miles, Elliot glanced in the rearview mirror, comforted by the sight of Caleb's lights. It felt strange, this sudden tether to a stranger, but it also felt right, like a melody he hadn't realized he'd been humming. They pulled into a small diner in the next town, a 24-hour spot called Rosie's with checkered floors and a jukebox playing soft country tunes. Caleb led the way inside, nodding to the waitress like he'd been here before. They slid into a booth, the vinyl creaking under them, and ordered coffee and pineapple for Elliot, pecan for Caleb. "So," Caleb said, leaning back, his hands wrapped around his mug. "What's the real story? Why Portland?" Elliot stared into his coffee, the steam curling like a question mark. He could lie, brush it off, but Caleb's gaze was patient, waiting. Redding wasn't home anymore. He said finally, "Not after I came out. Family didn't kick me out, but they didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat either. Figured Portland's got a better shot at letting me be me." Caleb's expression softened, but there was no pity in it, just understanding. That takes guts, leaving everything behind like that. Elliot shrugged, but the weight of it pressed against his chest. Didn't feel like guts. Felt like running. "Sometimes running's the bravest thing you can do," Caleb said, his voice low. "Takes a lot to know when to walk away." Elliot met his eyes, searching for judgment, but finding only warmth. "What about you? You always this nice to guys stranded on your beat." Caleb laughed, a sound that filled the quiet diner. "I'm off duty in about an hour. So technically, this is just me being a decent human. But yeah, I've got a soft spot for people who look like they're carrying the world." The words landed softly, but they stirred something in Elliot, a mix of hope and fear, like standing on the edge of a cliff. He wanted to ask if Caleb was like him, if the warmth in his eyes meant what Elliot hoped it did. But the question felt too big, too dangerous. Instead, he took a bite of pie, letting the sweetness ground him. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing like the highway outside. Caleb shared stories of his childhood in Eugene, of wanting to be a cop to make a difference, not just to enforce rules. Elliot told him about the art he used to make, sketches he'd stopped drawing when life got too heavy. The diner emptied out, the waitress yawning behind the counter, but neither of them moved to leave. As dawn crept closer, Caleb glanced at his watch. "I should let you get back on the road. Portland's waiting." Elliot nodded, but his chest ached at the thought of driving away. "Yeah, thanks for this." Caleb's smile was soft, almost shy. "Anytime. Elliot, you've got my number now. Use it if you need me." Elliot saved the number Caleb scribbled on a napkin, his fingers lingering on the paper. As they walked back to their vehicles, the first light of dawn painting the sky pink, Elliot felt something shift inside him, a spark of possibility, fragile but growing. The highway stretched toward Portland, but Elliot's mind was still in that diner, replaying Caleb's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he talked about his dog, a scruffy mutt named Juno. The napkin with Caleb's number sat on the passenger seat, a quiet promise Elliot wasn't sure he was brave enough to keep. By the time he reached the city, the morning sun was climbing, casting golden light over the Willamette River. Portland felt alive, vibrant, a far cry from Redding's stifling quiet. But it also felt overwhelming, like a canvas too big for his hesitant strokes. He found a cheap motel on the city's edge, a place called the Starlight with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed faintly. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, but it was his, paid for with the last of his savings. He dropped his duffel bag on the bed, the weight of his decision to leave Redding settling over him. This was freedom, but it was also loneliness, the kind that creeps in when you realize you're starting from nothing. Elliot pulled out his phone, now charged, and stared at Caleb's number. He typed out a text, made it to Portland. "Thanks again," then deleted it. Too forward. Too needy. He tossed the phone onto the bed and paced, his boots scuffing the worn carpet. He wasn't used to wanting connection, not after years of guarding himself against rejection. But Caleb had seen him, really seen him, and that scared him as much as it thrilled him. A knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find a woman, maybe 50, with graying curls and a warm smile. "I'm Rosa, the manager," she said, holding out a basket of toiletries. "Saw you check in. Figured you might need these. First night's always rough." Elliot took the basket, surprised by the gesture. "Thanks. I'm Elliot." "Welcome to Portland, Elliot," Rosa said, her eyes kind but sharp, like she could read the weight he carried. "You'll find your way. This city's good for new beginnings." He nodded, grateful but unsure how to respond. After she left, he sat on the bed, the basket beside him, and thought about new beginnings. Portland was supposed to be a place where he could be openly queer, where he could rebuild without fear. But the idea of reaching out to Caleb, of taking a chance on something real, felt like stepping into a spotlight after years in the shadows. He spent the day exploring the city, walking through Powell's books, its shelves towering like a labyrinth of stories he hadn't dared to write for himself. He wandered past coffee shops and murals, the air alive with the hum of a city that didn't care who he loved. But by evening, back in his motel room, the loneliness returned. Sharper now. He picked up the phone again, typed the text, and this time, hit send. Caleb's reply came within minutes. "Glad you made it. How's Portland treating you?" The words were simple, but they warmed Elliot like a hearth fire. They texted back and forth. Caleb's response is quick and easy, like he'd been waiting for Elliot to reach out. When Caleb mentioned he'd be in Portland the next day for a training seminar, Elliot's heart leapt. "Want to grab coffee?" Caleb's text read, "I know a spot. 2 p.m. tomorrow." Elliot stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. This was a chance to see if that spark from the highway could grow. He typed, "Sounds good. Name the place." The next day, Elliot arrived at a cozy coffee shop called the Beanery, its windows fogged with steam and the scent of espresso thick in the air. Caleb was already there, out of uniform, in a flannel shirt and jeans that made him look less like a cop and more like someone Elliot could imagine sharing a life with. His smile was the same, though, warm and steady, and it pulled Elliot across the room like a magnet. "You clean up nice," Elliot said, sliding into the seat across from Caleb, his attempt at humor masking the nerves buzzing under his skin. Caleb laughed, his eyes crinkling. "Figured the uniform might be a bit much for coffee. You settling in okay?" They talked over lattes, the conversation picking up where it left off at the diner. Caleb shared more about his life, how he'd grown up with a single mom who taught him to cook, how he'd joined the force to protect people like his cousin, who'd faced her own battles coming out. Elliot opened up about his art, how he used to sketch landscapes and faces, capturing moments he couldn't hold on to in real life. Caleb listened like every word mattered, and for the first time, Elliot felt like his story wasn't a burden. As they left the coffee shop, the afternoon sun casting long shadows, Caleb brushed his hand against Elliot's, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through him. "You ever think about picking up a pencil again?" Caleb asked, his voice soft. Elliot swallowed, the question hitting deeper than it should. "Maybe, if I find something worth drawing." Caleb's smile was quiet, knowing, "I bet you will." They parted with a promise to meet again, Caleb's number now a fixture in Elliot's phone. As he walked back to the motel, the city buzzing around him, Elliot felt a shift. Portland wasn't just an escape anymore, it was a place where he could build something. Maybe with someone like Caleb, who made him feel safe enough to try. Days turned into weeks, and Portland began to feel like home. Elliot found a job at a small art supply store, surrounded by paints and canvases that tempted him to create again. He rented a tiny studio apartment above a bakery, the scent of fresh bread waking him each morning. But the real anchor was Caleb, who became a constant in his life through texts, calls, and visits whenever Caleb's schedule allowed. Their second meeting turned into a third, then a fourth, a hike in Forest Park, a movie night at a local theater, a quiet evening at Caleb's apartment in Eugene when Elliot drove down for the weekend. Each moment deepened the connection, a slow burn that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Caleb was open about his bisexuality, sharing stories of his own struggles with acceptance, and it gave Elliot courage to be honest about his fears, his hopes, his past. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the Willamette, Caleb took Elliot's hand, his fingers warm and steady. "I like this," Caleb said, his voice low. "Us. Whatever this is." Elliot's heart raced, the weight of the moment pressing against him. "Me too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not used to this. To feeling like I can have this." Caleb's thumb brushed over Elliot's knuckles, a small gesture that felt like a promise. "You can. You deserve it, Elliot." The words broke something open in Elliot, a dam he'd built to keep out hope. He leaned in, and Caleb met him halfway, their lips brushing in a kiss that was soft, tentative, then deepening with a hunger that had been building since that night on the highway. The world fell away, leaving only the warmth of Caleb's touch, the certainty of his presence. But not everything was easy. Elliot's past lingered, a shadow that crept in during quiet moments. He'd wake from nightmares of Redding, of his father's cold silence, of the word faggot scrawled on his locker in high school. Caleb was patient, listening when Elliot needed to talk, holding him when words weren't enough. But the fear of losing Caleb at him. One night, after a long shift, Caleb showed up at Elliot's apartment, his face drawn. "Got a call today," he said, sitting on the couch, his hands clasped tightly. "A kid in my precinct, barely 16, got beat up for holding his boyfriend's hand in public. I couldn't do enough for him." Elliot sat beside him, his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You did what you could. You're not like the cops I grew up with." Caleb shook his head, his jaw tight. "Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle. I became a cop to protect people, but there's so much hate out there." Elliot pulled him close, their foreheads touching. "You're making a difference. You made one for me." Caleb's eyes softened, and he kissed Elliot, a slow, grounding kiss that pushed back the darkness. They held each other, the world outside fading, and Elliot realized he was falling in love not just with Caleb, but with the possibility of a life where he could be whole. But trouble was brewing. Elliot started noticing a car parked across from his apartment, a gray sedan that lingered too long. At first, he brushed it off, but when he saw it again at the art store, his unease grew. He mentioned it to Caleb, who frowned, his cop instincts kicking in. "Could be nothing," Caleb said, but his tone was serious. "Keep an eye out. Tell me if you see it again." Elliot nodded, but the unease settled in his chest, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. He didn't tell Caleb about the anonymous note he found under his door a few days later. Scrawled in block letters, "You don't belong here." The words echoed Redding, stirring old fears. He burned the note, telling himself it was a prank, but the shadow of it lingered. As their relationship deepened, so did the stakes. Caleb invited Elliot to meet his mom, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Lila who welcomed Elliot with a hug and a plate of homemade tamales. The visit was a glimpse into a future Elliot hadn't dared imagine, a family that accepted him, a partner who loved him openly. But the gray sedan followed him back to Portland, and the notes kept coming, each one more threatening, "Leave or else." Elliot hid them from Caleb, not wanting to burden him, but the fear was eating at him. He started sketching again, pouring his anxiety into charcoal drawings of stormy skies and shadowed figures. Caleb noticed the change. The way Elliot's smiles grew forced. But when he asked, Elliot deflected, afraid to let the darkness touch what they'd built. The notes escalated, slipping under Elliot's door every few days, each one sharper, more personal. "Faggot. You're not welcome." The words carved into his peace, dragging him back to Redding's cruelty. He stopped sleeping, his nights spent staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps outside his apartment. The gray sedan was a constant now, parked just out of sight, but close enough to feel like a threat. Caleb sensed something was wrong. Over dinner at a quiet Italian place, he reached across the table, his hand covering Elliot's. "You're not yourself. he said, his voice gentle but firm. Talk to me. Elliot wanted to tell him, to spill everything about the notes, the car, the fear clawing at him. But he couldn't bear the thought of Caleb looking at him with pity. Or worse, pulling away to protect himself. Just tired. Elliot lied, forcing a smile. Work's been rough. Caleb didn't buy it. But he didn't push. Just squeezed Elliot's hand and changed the subject. They talked about lighter things, Juno's latest antics. A camping trip they planned for the spring, but the weight of Elliot's secret hung between them. The breaking point came one night when Elliot found a brick through his window. A note tied to it, "Get out or you're dead." Glass littered the floor, the cold night air pouring in. He called Caleb, his voice shaking, and within 20 minutes, Caleb was there, his cruiser parked outside, his arms pulling Elliot into a fierce hug. "Why didn't you tell me?" Caleb asked, his voice thick with worry as he read the note. "How long has this been going on?" Elliot broke, the truth spilling out the notes. The sedan, the fear he'd tried to bury. Caleb listened, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and protectiveness. "You're not alone in this," he said, cupping Elliot's face. "I'm here. We'll figure it out." Caleb stayed the night, sleeping on the couch to keep watch. He filed a report, dusted the brick for prints, and had the precinct run the sedan's plates. The car was registered to a man named Derek Holt, a name Elliot didn't recognize, but one that made Caleb's face harden. "He's got a record," Caleb said. "Harassment. Mostly. I'll look into it." Elliot felt a mix of relief and dread. Having Caleb in his corner was everything. But the threat was real now. Tangible. He started carrying a pocket knife, a small act of defiance against the fear. Caleb taught him basic self-defense. Their sessions in the apartment filled with laughter and lingering touches. A reminder of what they were fighting for. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, Elliot chopping vegetables, Caleb stirring a pot of sauce, the tension broke. Caleb set down the spoon, turned to Elliot, and said, "I love you." The words were quiet but certain, like a vow. Elliot froze, the knife still in his hand, his heart pounding. "I love you too," he said, the words new and terrifying but true. They kissed, the kitchen warm with the scent of garlic and the promise of a future they both wanted. But the threats didn't stop. Derek Holt was questioned but released, claiming he'd sold the sedan months ago. The notes kept coming, now left on Elliot's truck, at the art store, even slipped into his mailbox. Caleb grew more protective, insisting Elliot stay with him in Eugene until they could track down the source. Elliot resisted, not wanting to run again, but the fear was wearing him down. One night, alone in his apartment, Elliot heard a knock. He grabbed the knife, his pulse racing, and opened the door to find Rosa, the motel manager, now a friend who checked in on him. "Saw someone lurking outside," she said, her face grim. "You need to get out of here. Elliot, come stay with me tonight." He packed a bag, his hands shaking, and followed Rosa to her car. As they drove away, he saw the sedan in the rearview mirror, its headlights cold and unyielding. He called Caleb, who was already on his way, his voice sharp with urgency. "Stay with Rosa. I'm coming for you." Elliot's world was shrinking, the safety he'd found in Portland slipping away. But Caleb's voice on the phone, steady and fierce, was a reminder that he wasn't alone. He clung to that, to the love they'd built. As the sedan's headlights faded into the night, Elliot stayed with Rosa for a few days, her small house a haven of warmth and cluttered bookshelves. She didn't ask too many questions, just made him coffee and told stories of her own youth, of fighting for her place as a Latino woman in a world that often tried to silence her. Her strength grounded him, but the fear lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. Caleb worked tirelessly, coordinating with Portland PD to trace the sedan and the notes. They found a Lita security camera near the art store that caught a man matching Derek Holt's description slipping a note under the door. Caleb showed Elliot the grainy footage, his hand steady on Elliot's shoulder. "We're close," he said. "He's not getting away with this." But Derek was slippery, always one step ahead. The sedan vanished, replaced by a black SUV that started appearing near Rosa's house. Elliot's nightmares grew worse, visions of Redding blending with the present, the word faggot echoing in his mind. He started sketching again. Dark, jagged lines that captured his fear, but also portraits of Caleb, his smile, his steady gaze, a reminder of what he was fighting for. One evening, Caleb arrived at Rosa's, his face grim. "We got a hit on the SUV. It's registered to a guy named Mark Tanner, Derek's cousin. They're working together." He pulled Elliot into a hug, his voice fierce. "I'm not letting them touch you." Elliot clung to him, the weight of the threat pressing against his chest. "Why me?" he whispered. "I just wanted to start over." Caleb's hands framed his face, his eyes burning with determination. "Because you're here, living your truth. That scares people like them. But you're stronger than they'll ever be." The next day, Caleb set up a sting operation with Portland PD. They planned to catch Derek and Mark at the art store, where Caleb suspected they'd leave another note. Elliot insisted on being there, despite Caleb's protests. "This is my life," Elliot said, his voice steady. "I need to face it." The night of the sting was cold, the art store's windows dark except for a single light in the back. Elliot waited in Caleb's cruiser, parked a block away, his heart pounding. Caleb was inside with two other officers, wired and ready. Elliot's phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. "Stay strong, kid. You've got this." Minutes dragged like hours. Then, a crackle on the radio. Caleb's voice sharp. "Suspects approaching. Gray hoodie and blue jacket." Elliot's breath caught as he saw two figures slip toward the store, one holding an envelope. The street erupted in motion, officers moving in, Caleb's voice barking orders. Derek and Mark tried to run, but they were tackled, handcuffs snapping shut. Elliot stepped out of the cruiser, his legs shaky but his resolve firm. He walked toward the store, where Caleb was reading Derek his rights. Derek's eyes met Elliot's, filled with hate, but Elliot didn't flinch. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own strength, built from years of surviving, now bolstered by Caleb's love. "You okay?" Caleb asked, pulling Elliot aside as the suspects were loaded into a patrol car. Elliot nodded, his voice thick. "Because of you." Caleb's smile was tired but warm. "We did this together." That night, they went back to Caleb's apartment in Eugene, the tension of the day melting into quiet relief. They made love, slow and deliberate, each touch a promise to keep fighting, to keep loving. As they lay together, the moonlight streaming through the window, Elliot felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. But the threat wasn't entirely gone. Derek and Mark were in custody, but the investigation revealed they were part of a small group targeting queer people in the area. Caleb vowed to keep digging, to protect others like Elliot. And Elliot, inspired by Caleb's courage, started drawing again, not just for himself, but for the community he was beginning to find in Portland. Months later, Elliot stood in a small gallery in Portland, his sketches lining the walls. The exhibit, titled Out of the Shadows, was his story landscapes of fear and hope, portraits of Caleb, of Rosa, of the queer community he'd found in the city. The room buzzed with people, their voices warm with admiration. But Elliot's eyes were on Caleb, who stood across the room, beaming with pride. The threats had stopped. Derek and Mark facing charges that would keep them away for years. The investigation had uncovered others, a network of hate that Caleb and his team were dismantling. Piece by piece, Elliot had become part of that fight, volunteering at a local LGBTQ center, sharing his story to help others find their strength. As the gallery event wound down, Caleb pulled Elliot outside, the night air cool against their skin. They walked to the same bench by the Willamette where they'd first kissed, the river reflecting the city's lights. Caleb took Elliot's hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns. "I'm proud of you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just survive. You built something beautiful." Elliot's throat tightened. "I couldn't have done it without you." That night on the highway, you saved me. Caleb shook his head, his eyes shining. You were already saving yourself. I just gave you a push. They kissed, the world soft and quiet around them, and Elliot felt the weight of his past lift. Replaced by a future, he could see clearly a life with Caleb, with art, with a community that embraced him. He thought of that midnight on the highway, the moment Caleb's smile had pierced the darkness, and realized it wasn't just safety he'd found that night. It was home. Elliot pulled back, his hand still in Caleb's. You said I was safe with you, he murmured. You were right. Caleb's dimple flashed, his smile a promise. Always will be. They stood there, the river flowing beside them, the city alive with possibility. Elliot's sketches had captured his journey. But this moment, this love, this strength was the truest art he'd ever created. And as they walked back to the gallery, hand in hand, Elliot knew he'd never have to run again.